Hello guys, my name is Sergii Ivashchenko. I'm from community engineering team from Magento. My job is basically to work with contributors, to work with Magento developers and help them to improve Magento. We have several community projects going on in community engineering team, and one of these community projects is GraphQL. About this project I'm going to talk today. So just to ensure that we are on the same page, I would like to start from the short introduction about what GraphQL is and some basics of this query language. GraphQL is a query language for the web API that was developed by Facebook a lot of time ago. Probably in 2012 the development has started, but it was publicly released in 2015, so not so much time ago. And since it was publicly released, it's rapidly growing popularity. The thing is that GraphQL API is very different from the conservative approaches to API, and the main difference is that it has only one endpoint for all the requests, and the queries updates are defined by the body of the request, not the endpoint. GraphQL in Magento 2 is a community project and is developed inside and outside of Magento by the contributors. The most of framework parts are developed by the internal teams. The most of the coverage is delivered by contributors to the open source repository. Right now, GraphQL in Magento 2 covers a lot of functionality. It covers catalog, full checkout workflow, and a lot of other modules. But the work is still ongoing, and a lot of modules are covered with GraphQL and GraphQL queries and mutations right now. GraphQL, as I said, it's community-driven development. It's community-driven, and that means that first of all you can see all the updates, all the information about how development is going, what's covered, and what's up next in the publicly available resources like GitHub repository, our dashboard, then Hub, and resources. I will talk about them in details a bit later. And basics. So GraphQL is basically a definition of the query language. Here you can see an example of really simple query, and on the slide you can see that all the data is defined in the schema of GraphQL, so all the fields have to be specified on the server side. That makes it much more transparent for the API clients to use. In this case, it's a query API for customer that says that we can retrieve customer information, all the fields specified, and there are additional types included, subsequent types included, like customer addresses and streets in the customer addresses. So considering this query definition, if the client will request the first name of the customer, it will get just the first name. If it will request another field, it will get just the field that it is requested. That's another important thing about GraphQL that helps a lot with extensibility of the GraphQL APIs. Basically, client only gets data. Client requesting for customer data doesn't get all the fields of the customer, but only the fields that the request specifies. GraphQL is supporting CQRS principle by introducing two global types, like query and mutations. So originally all the requests, to GraphQL are supposed to be sent by post HTTP request, but to identify the updates and the requests that are changing the system states and separate them from the queries that are just getting the information and not updating the system. There are those two global types. So because of customer or client of GraphQL API is obliged to specify the fields that he would like to get, it's really easy to update the GraphQL schema, adding another field without any changes, without the required update of the API version. Because while client is not requesting the new field, the existing system behavior works without any changes. The new field can be added and processed separately from all the other fields. The new query can be added, the new mutation can be added this way. So now I would like to switch to the implementation, like how GraphQL is implemented and how it is done in Magento 2. So in Magento 2, GraphQL is available right now. Actually, it's available starting from the previous release, and the basic components, the general GraphQL implementation is done in the framework, in Magento framework GraphQL namespace. There are coverage modules. There are two general basic modules that are empowering coverage modules with the functionality, and they are called Magento GraphQL module and Magento GraphQL cache, for the module for caching. And there are lots of coverage modules. Basically, the module that is covering another module with GraphQL APIs, providing the queries and mutations for existing Magento module, can be found by the naming convention. And the naming convention is the module name and GraphQL syntax. For example, queries and GraphQL implementation for catalog module can be found in catalog GraphQL module. Also, as part of Magento GraphQL implementation, there is a really nice GraphQL infrastructure implemented for tests, for Web API tests. GraphQL Web API test doesn't work exactly like SOAP and REST tests that we used to see in Magento, but they have a PHP unit test case based class called GraphQL Abstract that simplifies writing tests for GraphQL endpoints a lot, and I'll show you details a bit later. So the structure of any coverage module of GraphQL is pretty simple. It's some basic required stuff for any Magento module, like module XML, composer JSON, and registration.php. And the only thing that you have to implement to cover your module or Magento module with GraphQL API is schema, the example of which I showed you on previous slides, and resolvers. Resolvers are PHP classes responsible for resolving the requested fields to the data that will be returned. Also, I would like to note that there is a GraphQL area introduced to Magento. The GraphQL area is an area like front-end on an admin HTML area for configuration, but this area will be, so the configuration from GraphQL area will be loaded only while processing GraphQL requests. So this is a simple example of GraphQL implementation in Magento. You can see it's basically the same specification of the fields, but what I would like you to pay attention to, that here the field, right on this slide, the query and the mutation are mapped to a resolver. that is responsible for basically all the operations and loading the data. It's a kind of controller for GraphQL. Resolver can be specified for a query, for mutation, or for any specific field. And the root resolver that is specified for query will be executed first, and then all the additional resolvers that you might have specified or overridden for the fields will be executed and will update the information that was provided by the root resolvers, and so on down the hierarchy tree. The resolver is basically a class that have to implement resolver interface, and resolver interface is just one method that is providing all the information required to provide the response for the API. It's basically all the information supplied for request and the context of the application. Here is an example of GraphQL tests. I'm not sure if you can see everything clear, but so the approach to GraphQL tests is very similar to the approach to integration tests. So here we have a fixture. The fixture setups data. Then the only thing you need to do is just to prepare a query, specify a query that you would like to test, and call the GraphQL query function from the GraphQL abstract class provided by Magento testing infrastructure, and get a response, validate that response is what you expected to get. There is much more about GraphQL, and there is a lot of information on our dev docs that if you are interested in GraphQL or if you would like to work on GraphQL implementation, I really encourage you to go through the documentation that is available on our dev docs. But now I would like to show you the simple example of the extensibility that you might need to use if you'd like to update, if you'd like to extend the GraphQL query or mutation that is provided by Magento. So, for example, the task is to add a field to an entity. In this case, let's say we would like to add an identity number to customer entity. To do this, you need to update two files, to create two files within your module, and that will be a schema, GraphQLs that will add the field to the customer type. All the GraphQL schemas in Magento are merged like configuration. So in this case, identity number will be added to the list of fields available for customer, and specify a resolver for this field. The resolver for this field can have any logic you need to retrieve the required information. And after implementing of those two files, you can request the new field from the front end. It will be added to the Magento customer entity. Here I would like to say that mutations are not extensible in this way as queries. So in case you need new mutation, you will need to, in case you need to update a mutation or customize it, you will need to introduce a new mutation to the GraphQL schema. Now I'd like to talk a bit about the future. So GraphQL is a really key component of Magento technical future, because really lots of things are built around GraphQL, and GraphQL will allow us to do, and right now allow us to do a lot of updates to Magento technology, probably even Magento architecture. I'd like to say that, so coverage of GraphQL implementation is driven by community, but there is a lot of stuff going on internally, and internal team is responsible for GraphQL performance and optimization. As for coverage track, right now GraphQL covers lots of functionality. There is full checkout workflow covered with simple virtual product and offline payments. The work is going on right now to cover different product types and online payment methods, and add the coverage to my account functionality of the customer. On the performance track, what's completed already is HTTP GET support. So basically, GraphQL supports not only POST requests, but GET requests with the same GraphQL syntax, the same GraphQL approach, but encoded as a GET parameter. And with the GET support, GraphQL can be cached in full page cache, built-in full page cache, Varnish, or Fastly. Right now, Magento is working on a cache invalidation feature for GraphQL. Basically, it's not a feature, it's a cache invalidation approach for the resolvers. GraphQL on the cache, making resolvers lightweight, so achieving as fast as possible response from GraphQL queries. That is one of the main goals here, and performance and functional tests coverage for GraphQL. Under the consideration, if we think even further, the things that are really closely related to GraphQL and that are right now discussed in Magento architecture and even in public Magento architecture discussion meeting is Storefront API, Webonics replacement, and GraphQL only instance, and much more. A bit more details about the features that are currently under the consideration and that are right now in implementation. So, as for lightweight resolvers, right now there is work going on the query resolvers to make them lightweight. And the approach is to defer the response processing, so to aggregate request data, and instead of making each resolver in the hierarchy tree performing the queries and performing resource-consuming operations, to execute all the resource-consuming queries at once after the aggregating data through the resolvers tree. And that's something that is implemented for each resolver. So basically, new lightweight resolvers are implemented that will be an additional resolvers to an existing ones, and maybe sometimes they will, after some time, they will replace the existing resolvers and provide better performance. Indexers are used for retrieving data, so it's this approach is a bit different from some Magento UI that is currently available out of the box. So these resolvers are going to be delivered as a separate set of modules, and after some time they might replace the existing resolvers. In terms of existing resolvers will be kept, but new resolvers will be the preference for the front-end and communication implementation. In terms of making resolvers lightweight, there is an approach that we are currently considering, and that is refactoring, basically introducing new API programming API for processing all the entities in batches. So right now in Magento 2, most of the APIs are tied to work with one specific instance of entity. For example, getProductPrice function requires product ID and returns price for one specific product. Such APIs will be adjusted, and new APIs will be added that will work on with the arrays and process several products at once or several entities at once. So in this case, we can request product price. If we need price for one product, we are supplying the array with one entity, one product ID. If we need more products can be returned in one call. It is a really huge improvements for catalog rendering, like catalog product list rendering, and so on. Finally, there is a Storefront API that we are discussing right now. And Storefront API is kind of a programming APIs that will be a level between the internal implementation and, on the one side, layout blocks with templates that are used for conservative rendering of the pages, and a programming API for GraphQL that can be used by PWA or other frontends and integrations. Storefront API will be implemented in a really lightweight way. All the features I discussed previously are considered to be included in Storefront API implementation. So that will be batch queries, that will be deferred query processing, that will be index usages, and so on. And these Storefront APIs are going to be implemented in stateless and completely replaceable way. So they will be independent from each other, and they will not work with deep trees of the information. So for example, the price API will return only price. Product API will return only product information without subsequent information, like if the product contains attributes and additional information that may be moved to separated to another API. But performing a query for such performing a query from the front end through GraphQL, because of GraphQL request specifics, you can aggregate all the queries you need in one request and retrieve all the information you need in one request, even though the Storefront implementation can be different services. Finally, I would like to tell about the processes that I used for GraphQL development, about the community. So while GraphQL is available from Magento 2 repository, it's available in core. All the work on GraphQL is going on in Magento GraphQL CE repository. So that's a repository to aggregate all the issues, all the pull requests, and you can watch the progress in Magento GraphQL CE repository. And you can contribute, create issues, or create pull requests in Magento GraphQL CE repository. There is also a wiki with the documentation on GraphQL that's available from that repository. To understand what's been done, what are the updates on GraphQL coverage and implementation, there is a dashboard that can be accessed from the GraphQL repository on Projects tab, Backlog Dashboard, and it's always up to date. So the columns are self-explanatory, so you can just see which tasks are in progress, which tasks are scheduled to be done soon, and which have been just completed. GraphQL community project also uses ZenHub for even more transparent information for them, diagrams and burn down charts, and that's available from ZenHub. Finally, there is a really nice spot to communicate about GraphQL, and that's Community Engineering Slack Workspace. If you have not joined the Workspace, please do this. That's a link to get an invite to the Workspace. And the Workspace contains channels on all the community projects, and there is lots of channels with different discussions around Magento. There is a GraphQL channel where all the discussion is going, and on this screenshot, Valery is inviting is saying that GraphQL Sync Up is going to start. So GraphQL community project have public Sync Up meetings each Thursday at 3 p.m. UTC, so you can join, you can participate in the discussion, and sometimes they publish their recordings of the meeting. Actually, there are such Sync Up meetings, and for more projects, for all the community projects in Magento, and all the calendar of the meetings and all the projects can be observed on the open source Magento.com website. Finally, I would like to say thank you for all the contributors to GraphQL projects, to GraphQL community project, and the contribution partners that worked on GraphQL. And thank you.